Morning, everyone. My name is Angela Brogden and I'm the Principal Scrutiny Advisor to the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. Before we move to the formal meeting agenda, I have been asked by Councillor Lamb, who's Chair of the Scrutiny Board, to relay his apologies for today's meeting. In his absence, Councillor Stevenson has been nominated to chair today's meeting. So please, can I ask if all board members are agreeable? Thank you. So I'll now pass to you, Chair, to go through the formal agenda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela, and thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Scrutiny Board of Children and Family Scrutiny Board, Leeds City Council. It would be remiss of me not to say that Councillor Lamb always says this is the best scrutiny board, and we do have the best scrutiny board chair, but unfortunately he is rather ill at the minute. So we send our best wishes to him. I know he's watching, and we shall get going. Can we start with a round of introductions first, please? So I'm Councillor Ryan Stevenson, representing the Harewood Board, and I'm standing in as chair today, and we'll go around my left.
Good morning, I'm Helen Bellamy, School Staff Representative.
Tony Britton, representing the Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Karen Renshaw, representing Ardsey and Robin Hood Ward.
Good morning, Andrew Graham, representing the Church of England Diocese.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Martin, representing Round Hay Ward Councillor.
Good morning, Jordan Bowden, representing Round Hay, in solidarity to the staff striking today.
Good morning, Councillor Zara Hussain, representing the Round Hay Ward.
Hi there, Hannah Bithell, representing Kirkstall.
Councillor Jules Hesselwood, Bramley Stanley Ward, solidarity too with Councillor George.
Sorry, I'm Councillor Fiona Venner. I'm the Executive Board Member for Children and Adult Social Care and Health Partnerships. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Councillor Jonathan Pryor. I'm the Deputy Leader and Executive Member for Economy, Culture and Education.
Good morning, I'm Julie Longworth and I'm Interim Director for Children and Families.
Thank you. Good morning, I'm Erica Hines, the 0 to 19 lead at Leeds City Council.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ruth Terry, I'm Chief Officer for Children's Social Work.
Morning, everybody. I'm Val Waite. I'm Chief Officer for Learning Inclusion.
Hi everybody, my name is Tim Pouncey. I'm the Chief Officer for Resources and Strategy.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth for Farnham Wortley Ward.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Trish Smith, Pudgey Ward, and I'm subbing for Alan Lamb today. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Linda Richards from Wetherby Ward.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Angela, can you take us through items 1 to 5, please?
Thank you, Chair. So under item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under item 2, there are no items for exclusion. In relation to item 3, there are no late items. And under item 4, please may I ask at this point if board members have any declarations of interest? And I shall take silence as none. Thank you. And under item 5, we have apologies from Councillor Lamb, with Councillor Smith attending as substitute member, from Councillor Howley, Councillor Senior, and for co-opted member Kate Blacker.
Okay, thank you. The minutes are in the pack, item 6, agenda item 6. Are there any comments on the minutes? And if not, are we happy to approve with an accurate record? Yep. Okay, just before we move on to item 7, you will all be aware that His Majesty the King visited us a few weeks ago to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Child Friendly Leeds. So I asked Councillor Venner this morning and her furry friend to visit us and just give a quick update to the board on His Majesty's visit.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me to open the meeting in this way, because it's such a positive start to our meeting. As I'm sure you all know, this is Leeds Ted, who's the mascot of Child Friendly Leeds. he's also my alter ego in that I tweet as at Leeds Ted, and I would highly recommend to. Oh, Hannah's just told me he's not visible. So for anyone watching at home, I put him there thinking he'd be on camera. This is Leeds Ted with his Child Friendly Leeds badge. Yeah, any politicians in the room, I'd highly recommend tweeting as a little bear. People are much nicer to you than they are when you tweet as a politician. But yeah, the King visited Leeds very early in his reign, which obviously was a great honour for the city. He visited the library and the art gallery to see the exhibition, The World Reimagined, and also to visit a fantastic exhibition by the Leeds Jamaica Society about called From Romance to Rebellion, about second generation migrants from the Caribbean and their experience of coming of age in the 70s and 80s. And he unveiled a plaque to celebrate 10 years of Child Friendly Leeds, which is where Ted comes in, which felt really special because the Queen launched Child Friendly Leeds in her Golden Jubilee year in 2012. So it felt really lovely that the King came to Leeds so quickly after becoming our King and unveiled a plaque to celebrate 10 years of Child Friendly Leeds. And he then went on to visit Leeds Building Society to look at some of their work around financial inclusion and the cost of living crisis. So he had a really very comprehensive visit to Leeds, and it was, I have to say, it was absolutely delightful. So Councillor Stevenson, Councillor Pryor, Julie, I don't think there was anyone else here who was in the room at the art gallery. It was just a really lovely atmosphere because there were a lot of children there, including the children's mayor. And the sense of excitement waiting for him to arrive was just wonderful. And there were lots and lots of people outside, members of the public. And the King was late getting to us. And I think he was probably late going to the next place because he spent so long talking to people. So there'd been groups of us that were prepared to meet him. But in addition to meeting us, he spent a lot of time talking to the crowds outside. And then when he was in the gallery, talking to other people as well, which was just really special. And I think people very much appreciated. So when he came to me, I was Councillor Pryor and I were with Baroness Blake, who launched Child Friendly Leeds with the Queen 10 years ago, and Alison Lowe, the Deputy Mayor, and Leeds Ted. And all I wanted from the day was to get a picture of the King with Leeds Ted. And I managed to get lots that people took for me, and a particularly lovely one that I emailed to Councillor Stevenson that the official council photographer took. The King looked a bit puzzled. I don't think he was expected to meet a bear, but obviously there is quite a history of the royal family and bears with the Queen and Paddington, so he dealt with it very well. And then I was asked to go on the news later to speak about the royal visit, and I wanted to get Ted on the news as well. So it's my job now, managing Ted's comms. I don't have time to do anything else really. But no, it was wonderful. And he was great with our children's mayor, who's a young man with additional needs. And he was just lovely with the children, actually. He was very relaxed, and it was much less formal than I was expecting. He hugged one of the artists, he shook all our hands, seemed very comfortable and seemed to like being in Leeds. So it was a really, really positive day and a great honour for the city, and particularly special, I think, for the children who were there. So yeah, thank you for asking me to open the meeting by talking about our royal visit.
Thank you, Rick. You've just blown completely apart the magic of us believing that Ted was doing his own tweets. But anyway, I think on behalf of the board, we'll just thank the council staff as well that played a role in organising the visit, because those of us that were there did see that it was hectic at times in terms of people managing it, but it was smooth running. So thanks to all involved, including the young people who met the King as well. We'll move on to item 7 then on our workforce recruitment and retention in Leeds item. So if I could ask Councillor Venner and Pryor to make some opening remarks first. We have got Councillor Harland en route as well, and then we'll go over to officers as well. So Councillor Venner and Pryor.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Chair. This is a report on workforce issues in the Children and Families Directorate, and it follows a paper that I brought to the Executive Board in July, and it updates that. So the report outlines the chronic pressure children's services are under and outlines steps that we're taking to resolve the issues. And this includes addressing issues relating to terms and conditions and an extensive recruitment and retention strategy. The report situates Leeds in the regional and national context of a crisis in social care recruitment. It also does highlight that Leeds is actually has a lower turnover rate than most authorities, including other outstanding authorities. It's not as explicit in this paper as it was in the exec board report, but obviously this is in the context of needing, chronic underfunding of the sector. And the report does reference poverty, child poverty, and the impact that's having on services locally and nationally in hugely increasing demand. And the report highlights the national picture, which is obviously affecting us locally as well, of social workers leaving contracted roles to join agencies, which is particularly affecting young social workers in the first 5 years of their careers. And you can really, really understand why in a cost of living crisis, young workers are going where the money is. But we got to a situation where agencies were charging obscene amounts and councils were outbidding each other for agency workers, and that was happening nationally. So the DCSs in Yorkshire and Humber have signed a memo of cooperation, which sets out what is the maximum we will pay for agency workers, and that stops that practice, and it means we're not outbidding each other. That's seen nationally as a model of good practice, and other areas are looking at doing similar things because it is a national problem. On caseloads, the report identifies that less people have very high caseloads, in that nobody now has a caseload over 40. However, more people have caseloads over 20, which is higher than we would want. Importantly, the report details the way in which children and families are safeguarded in this challenging context. And I spend as much time as I can with children and families, which is definitely the best part of my role, and also with our frontline staff. So I do get to hear very directly how challenging life is on the front line of children's social work at the moment, and how hard staff are working to deliver compassionate and effective support to families. And importantly, the report discusses what we're doing to support staff wellbeing. Filling our vacancies will bring down caseloads, and the report details our recruitment strategy, which includes international recruitment, which we're doing for the first time with adults as well. So that's a joint operation. The report highlights some of the Ofsted comments from their examination of over 500 cases over a very thorough 3-week inspection earlier in the year. And they were assured that children were still receiving exemplary support, because at that point, the caseloads were higher than they are now. And they were still assured that children and families were receiving outstanding services. But of course, we're not complacent, and we continue to implement our improvement plan. The report references some of the national work we're asked to do. So it includes the work we do with the Department for Education on the Supporting Families Protecting Children project. I sit on the National Local Government Association Children and Young People's Board, and Tom Reardon is one of only a few people who's on the national board for the review of children's social care and the implementation of that. That obviously demonstrates Leeds being held in high regard, but also means we do get to lobby nationally on these issues. We do get to have a national platform where we can talk to other councils, across the country, cross party, about the problems that we're all facing in children's services at the moment. So I'd conclude by saying we do have serious workforce challenges across the department, which are part of a national crisis in adults and children's social care, but also in the public sector more widely, as some of you will know from other roles you're in. And it's really important that we support the plan to address these, and that we champion Leeds as a great place to work to enable us to attract more staff and continue to deliver outstanding services to the children and families of this city. Thank you.
Just to add briefly to that before Julie comes in, I suppose it's worth mentioning the NEU strikes today, which obviously Councillor Bowden and Councillor Hesselwood have referenced already. So in the report, kind of paragraph 17 and 18, obviously reference a huge crisis in teacher retention at the moment. An NEU survey last year said that half of teachers couldn't see themselves working in the profession within 5 years. Given we're already struggling to recruit to a lot of posts, given we're struggling to recruit to a lot of posts in learning inclusion too, this is a national crisis. The strikes today around teaching in FE, which I was lucky enough to go and meet and chat to some people this morning about, they've had a pay cut of I think it's over 20% in real terms since 2010, and the current pay offer of 5% offers another real terms pay cut. Given where inflation is at the moment, there are a lot of reasons around teachers not coming into the profession, not being able to, not choosing to stay into the profession. Pay is just one of them, but a particularly significant one. In paragraph 18, it details high workload is cited by 51% of those in the teaching profession. Lack of government trust cited by 53%. A reduced status of the profession cited by 66%. So this is something which, while obviously most of the paper is in Councillor Venner's portfolio, there is a crisis across the board within education as well.
Okay, Julie, do you want to run us through some comments on the report?
Yeah, I'll just come in really and just add to the comments that have already been made. You know, as we know, there is an absolute crisis nationally in terms of children and family social care staff, but also in terms of the public sector. So our partners are facing exactly the same challenges as we are. In 2021, you know, out of the social workers, as an example, who left the profession, 77% of those left children's social care for good, and 23% left to go to agency. You know, it is a challenge for us. It's a challenge nationally in terms of the remuneration that social workers and others can get when they move to agency. It is an issue that has been highlighted in the independent review of children's social care. And I understand that it is an issue. As an example, I have heard that in Northern Ireland, they're actually looking to ban agency, remove agency. So I think it's a movable feast. It's something that's very topical at the moment and something that we're very mindful of. Just in relation to the regional context, we have got almost a third of children's services in the region that are judged as inadequate, and that puts additional pressure. One local authority, as an example, had up to 170 agency staff. So when other local authorities in the region are competing and trying to attract agency staff, it's very, very difficult in terms of filling vacancies. Having said that, as has already been mentioned, we've got a really robust recruitment and retention strategy right across the directorate. We actually did win an award, the Children Young People Now Awards, in 2018 for our social work career progression pathway. And that's something that we're continuing to build on, not just for social work, but for all of our posts. I think, as has been referenced, there is a decline. There's been a decline, not least really as a result of the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, around people choosing to go into particular professions. As an example, education psychology and social work in particular. Having said all that, and I think Councillor Venner has referenced, our turnover rate is a third lower than the national average, and that's because we continue to invest in recruitment and retention strategies. Part of that, you know, is a real focus on staff wellbeing, health and well-being, and the report does make reference to a range of activity that we have in place to support our staff, because we recognise the challenges on them, you know, of the current climate. The report references safeguarding, as you would expect it to reference, and we're confident. Again, we have a range of quality assurance activity, you know, supervision, particular support for newly qualified staff, and we are, you know, have that scrutiny in terms of our safeguarding and our performance in relation to that. I'll probably leave it for there and open up to others for questions.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Yep, Helen, first question.
First, just to thank Councillor Pryor for you know, joining NEU members on the picket line at Notre Dame, and also solidarity with the UCU members who are picketing today, striking. I just wanted, it's not as much a question, I just wanted to add some more information really. Yeah, pay is a massive issue in education because as I think it was Councillor Pryor said, there's been a 20%, at least a 20% cut in the pay of teachers and 25% cut in the pay of support staff who do an incredible job, and it's a very professional job, and they're paid not much more. It's sometimes less than people stacking shelves in supermarkets, not to belittle that, but it's not such a professional, demanding job. And just to say, there's the direct effect of pay, particularly at this time, but also school budgets are so, I don't know, in such a difficult situation that there is so many fewer staff in schools at the moment. So that has a massive impact on workload. A lot of the situation is largely due to decisions at national level. But I think locally, as unions, the way we can impact this situation is by having not necessarily pay, but workload, having trade union recognition agreements with MATs, and obviously we do have that with city council schools and with many MATs, but there are 2 MATs, one very large one that we do not have a trade union recognition agreement with. We have no negotiation. They are TGAP, the very largest one, and CLT. Now we have a rep at CLT who has reasonably good relationship with the head, so that's better than having no union presence. But there's a massive issue at TGAT. We've got our figures suggest that we have increased staff turnover with that MAT, and one of the schools that MAT took over not that long ago, a big secondary school, again, the contact that we have from members there show that we have massive staff turnover, and we really believe that if we're trying very, very hard to have relationships with that, to build a relationship with TGAT, which we know would be beneficial for the school. It would help for the schools in the MAT, it would help to reduce staff turnover. We can get in early and raise issues that maybe leadership are not aware of. So that is something that we really want to do with that MAT. There are other issues. Some schools have issues to do with the way the flattening the grass. Staff cannot work in schools where they come to school to do their very best for the children, and people are leaving because they cannot work in the environment where they don't believe that all children are supported. So I just wanted to highlight that today. Oh, Tim up.
Yep, Councillor.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's worth saying that, you know, those people that go into the teaching profession, it's a real calling. You know, it's not an easy job at all, and I think it's something that that those that go into the teaching profession are dedicated to. Both my parents are teachers and a lot of my family, so I know the stresses that a lot of teachers are under. And I think you highlight a really important point about union recognition. And this is some of the issue with the academies legislation, because some academies, you're right, will recognise unions and work fine with them. Others, and you obviously referenced the Gorse Academies Trust, I would like to see them do more on union recognition. Well, I would like them to recognise unions full stop. I think it stops problems becoming bigger. It helps develop those staff. It ensures that those staff have a decent place to work. And I think it's something that I would want to see all our schools engaging with the unions.
Councillor Hazelwood.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on both those comments. I've been on the NEU picket line this morning since 7:30, and solidarity with everybody out today, and I know my colleagues have as well on both sides of me here. And I just want to follow up on the comments of that particular Academy Trust and the problem we're having with teacher retention. I work for the NEU as well as being a councillor, so I see the issues that we have, that teachers have, and why they're leaving the profession. And that particular Academy Trust, they're not agreeing, they're not honouring PPA time. They're making staff work through their lunch. They're working from the minute they turn up to the minute the school finishes and beyond. And this, I could go on. And these are the reasons that we're losing teachers from the profession, because these academy trusts are allowed to set their own terms and conditions, allowed to set their own ways of working. And this is a real reason that we are losing teachers from the profession. There's some really worrying statistics produced in September this year that certain subjects, the take up of teacher training in certain subjects this September is worrying. That when that comes through in 3, 4, 5 years time, we already have a teacher shortage in this country. We are going to have a huge shortage in certain subjects in the next 4 or 5 years time. And it is really worrying. And unless we get to grips with this, and if these academy trusts are allowed to continue, we are going to see more and more and more teachers leaving the profession, and we are in a real crisis situation now.
Is there a question in there, Councillor Hazelwood?
Do you agree?
Do you agree?
Councillor Pryor?
Absolutely. I mean, under point 19 in the report, it talks about how the DfE's target for 22-23 was to recruit almost 21,000 new teachers to start teacher training, and the applicants were 12.5. Now, if you think that even some of those applicants won't even make it through, and if the number of teachers leaving the profession increases, that gap is just going to get wider and wider. I think the next few years are going to be really difficult for teachers and for schools in recruitment, and I just don't think enough is being done to address this nationally at all.
Okay, Councillor Smith, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of things. So do you want me to just do one at a time, or do you want me to just? Okay. So my first question is going back to social work, really. So can you confirm if the reported grievance from the social workers is now resolved, or is that ongoing, please? So that was number one. So I think that's very important to ask. The second question is, are those staff issues impacting the looked after children placements? Do we send the children all over the country, and do we map this? Or how is this monitored, please? And the third question is something I've picked up today from what you've said. The memo of understanding regarding the agency charge cap, is that being monitored? Because it could actually force resource out of our area, just a wider area, which I think that could impact us if it's not monitored. So thank you.
Julie.
Yeah, I'm happy to come back on those. Just in relation to the first point, the social work grievance, so that process is ongoing, and we continue to engage with our colleagues as part of that process. In terms of your second point, absolutely not. So again, we have really clear, robust quality assurance scrutiny mechanisms in place for all decision making in relation to children and young people and their plans, and all decision making is based around the needs of individual children and young people. We're very clear about our approach in Leeds, and that restorative approach in terms of keeping children in families with family as a priority. Where that's not possible, keeping children in a family setting and keeping children close to Leeds. So they are absolute key priorities for us, and that continues. In relation to the agency question, it is something that's been monitored closely. It's quite a new development, and as such, the regional directors of children's services across Yorkshire and Humberside discuss that regularly. So it is something that's been monitored. We absolutely will not have the case where there can be a negative impact of that in Leeds. And again, that's where we have to work collectively as directors of children's services across the region.
Yep, Councillor Vanna.
I just wondered if I could add a couple of points. So the area that the Memorandum of Cooperation covers is a really wide area. It's not just West Yorkshire, it's the whole of Yorkshire and the Humber. So people would have to travel a very long way if they were living in certain parts of that region, to another areas looking at doing a similar thing. So ideally, it will become national practice. I recently chaired a LGA weekend for experienced children's portfolio holders, and we had a presentation from Ofsted, from the Deputy Director, who's the Director for Social Care and Ofsted, are raising concerns about it nationally as well. It is seen as a really problematic issue. So I think even though we're not getting government guidance on this, the sector's kind of taking leadership around stopping the practice of agencies charging really obscene amounts. On the children being placed out of area, we're already the largest fostering local authority. We have a much higher percentage of our children in Leeds than other councils do. But at the last exec board, the one before, I took a report about increasing the amount that we pay our foster carers, which is really, really important, because having more services that we provide ourselves is a way of spending less money out of Leeds in the private sector. So we're planning to recruit a lot more foster carers and a new level of foster carers. They got to level 4 at the moment. They're going to go up to level 5. That'll be foster carers who can support children, adolescents who have very complex needs, have experienced traumatic starts in life. They're the placements that can be really expensive. So we're particularly recruiting foster carers to support adolescents. We've already got 10 of our own children's homes, which means we have less children out of area in children's homes than other councils, but we're building 8 more. Is that right? Is it 8? 4 more, 8 that are 1 or 2 beds. And again, they're going to be homes for children, generally adolescents, that really struggle to live with other children, so end up being placed in expensive external placements. So we're already in a really good place compared to lots of authorities, but we are expanding both our fostering and our own residential provision to keep more children in Leeds and spend less money out of Leeds as well. Thank you.
Councillor Richards.
Chair, thank you for the report as well. Very comprehensive and covers a lot of the issues that we know are there, but actually gives the data with it. So just to put it in the context of me, as we well know, I have been in the education system a long time. Indeed, in 1990, I made my first appointment of a history teacher. I had 46 applicants for a main scale post. Never happened again. Now you would be lucky to get a handful. I'm aware of that. It isn't something that's happened overnight. It is a long tail. I've watched it right the way through my career and seen that. It's been particularly evident in those subjects where it says here, science. You got very excited if you got a half decent clutch of people for any science post to do that. So my question would be, and it's something that we did at the time and then did further when I was part of the first Academy Trust in 2004, we made a virtue of making connections locally to recruit who we wanted, who we felt would be doing it for the right reasons. So the providers, the universities in the local area, I'm assuming that the same process is happening when you talk about looking at increased numbers, etc. So I'd be interested, that's my first question, what steps are being taken locally, it could be regionally, but to actually look at those particular issues with the patchwork of provision that we have now. And my second thing is kind of related in terms of recruitment in the social work area, which is a different pattern in that way. But I note that you talk about that the training which is happening for social work in Leeds, of those you anticipate X number to come through with this. And my question would be, are we now recruiting quicker than they're leaving? That's the key thing, isn't it? It may not be much, but it may be enough to hold that. And are we still seeing a deficit, and how does that impact, etc.? So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Erica.
Hello, Councillor Richards. As we both worked together a few years ago, so we both know the type of situation that you describe. Absolutely, schools are still developing links with universities and with teaching school hubs to develop strong links and a channel of new talent, if you like, coming through into their schools. Quite a lot of schools are being inventive as well about the way they try to recruit staff. So, for instance, quite a lot of them take on teaching assistants as graduates and develop those graduates and support them to become teachers. One school I know has a practice of contacting all their sixth formers who went to university 3 years after they left to offer them 1 year internships at the school, so that they get a first step into employment and they can see whether they like the option of teaching before they decide to train as a teacher. So schools are being inventive and trying to find ways of recruiting staff.
Okay, and there was a second question from Councillor Jude.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in that, Councillor Richards. So we're holding our own. I think, as has been described, it's not just social work posts. As an example, our residential children's services, again, nationally, that's a key area for us. Councillor Venner has talked about the 8 additional homes that we plan to bring on stream. So we have been able to recruit to a number of residential posts recently. We've recruited to social work posts, we've recruited to team manager posts. The other thing to say is we have a number of students working with us at the moment. I think out of the current cohort, which I think is over 50 or 50 thereabouts, 19 of those have already committed to wanting to apply and to remain in Leeds. Others are deliberating on that. Because of the cost of living crisis, we're seeing more students who may return home to live with parents, whereas previously they may have remained in Leeds. Having said that, we're confident that a large proportion of those students will remain in Leeds. It really is something that we are talking to partners about. I think we need to think about a collective response to what is an issue right across the partnership. So as an example, we have bronze meetings which take place in the south, the east and the west of the city, which include schools, health, the voluntary sector, and recruitment and retention is a real topic of discussion there at the moment, especially in terms of thinking about different pathways into the profession. So how we grow our own, thinking about apprenticeships, thinking about actually how do we communicate and engage with particular communities. There's a real opportunity here to diversify our workforce in terms of, not perhaps having the same approach as we might have done previously to entry qualifications, but actually, valuing life experience and personal experience and being able to appoint staff and then train them on the job. So again, a range of measures in place, and we continue to keep our finger on that.
Come back.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those answers. And yeah, they do sound exactly what is needed in that way. My question would be, it's almost joining those things up. So what connections are being made in schools to actually encourage students to, at that stage, I know, as Erica knows, the decisions are made around about year 9 and 10, because it's at that point that you start to take the bits of paper that will get you to where you need to be later. So what's being done with schools to actually say, this is a really good profession to be in, whether, whichever spectrum it is, what is being done there? Because I think, to me, in the base that we have in Leeds, we really should be able to, as you say, grow our own from that kind of level as well. Thanks.
Julie?
So again, I suppose, as I've outlined, these are the very conversations that are taking place within the bronze groups, really to share ideas around that. If I think about our Little Owl settings and our early year provision, as an example, there's been absolute direct links and communications with schools around encouraging young people, making, again, young people aware of apprenticeships and different routes into the profession. I think in some ways, I think there was some research, I think it's mentioned in the paper, you know, that some of the feedback, certainly from teachers who were leaving the profession, was something about the status really perhaps being undermined, or a reduction or deletion of that status. And I think, to be honest, it's beholden on us as public servants who love our jobs and have spent a lifetime in our roles, actually going out and having some of those conversations, whether that's with schools, whether that's with universities, to really champion the profession, whether that's teaching, you know, whether that's children's social care, whether that's the public sector generally. So again, we've got a whole host of actions aligned to that.
Okay, Councillor Forsyth next.
Right, thank you very much. I'd also like to express solidarity with the strikers today. So, as you correctly say about the social care, this being basically a national problem, which essentially is about funding nationally as well. But I really wanted to talk more about the education side, and then leading into question for that. The thing about education is that schools are funded by the pupils that are in that. So the funding follows the pupils. And the problem there is that if the national policy is that, it means that when there are falling roles, I've been in education since 1978, so I have seen some rises and falls, and then you've got increases in pupils coming through and decreases as well. So the bulge is going through secondary again at the moment, but there's then falling roles in primary. So in terms of the recruitment and retention, and I realise how difficult it is at the moment, my question really is about how you're able to plan for the future, because you know what the birth rate is that's sort of coming through at the moment, bearing in mind that really it's because of the way that education is funded, and that's a national decision, that's actually the problem behind this. Thank you.
Councillor Pryor.
So broadly speaking, we can look 4 years into the future for quite obvious reasons for primaries. Obviously, there are falling numbers in the Edinburgh region. It's something we've discussed as a council a lot. It's currently a 22% surplus of places, which moves to, I think it was a 36% surplus of places by 2026. There are other areas of Leeds which aren't quite at the same stage, but maybe a few years behind at the moment. Some of that is to do with birth rates. Equally, it's to do with changes to immigration. It's to do with fewer people having children, which tends to happen when the economy isn't so good. People think they can't afford to have children, so they delay it. And we've seen that with, you know, more and more people having children in their 30s rather than their 20s. Additionally, with kind of house building in some areas where there hasn't been a huge number. There was, I've forgotten the ratios, those members who are on planning may know, but with school place planning, it used to be, there was a kind of, they'd predict so many children per so many houses, and that ratio is just extended even further. So there is a difficulty, but you are right, these things do go up and down. Since 2010, we created, I think it was around 12,000 primary school places, because those children were there, and that's been some of the debate recently. You know, some of where the population falls have been where we've extended school places, but you can't say to those children who are 4, sorry, come back when you're 7, because there's not a school place for you now. You just have to deal with it there and then. So it is something we're keenly looking to in the future. We know some schools in a few areas have already reduced their PANs to anticipate this. But as you say, the per pupil funding is a problem with it. We've seen that cut by 9% since 2010. I think it was just over £6,000 per pupil. Now it's just over £5,000 per pupil. And it means that when those pupil figures drop, those schools have got far less flexibility. It's far more difficult for the schools to essentially wait it out and wait for the population to go back up. It takes those issues around population to a critical place.
Helen, next.
Right, I have got a couple of questions, but I just want to start with a little bit more information. So pay obviously is an issue for people striking today, but it's also the fact that any pay rises, which haven't been real term pay rises, have been unfunded. So those pay rises for school staff come out of the budget, which means there are fewer you can recruit fewer school staff for those schools. So that's a massive issue. And what I'd like to ask everybody here today, and to spread the word for people to please, if they can, lobby their MPs, because that is something that we really need. Not only do we need better pay for school staff, but we need any pay rises to be funded so that schools can afford to run. Now, the second thing is, I know that there are quite a lot of councillors here today, and going back to that trade union recognition agreement and how important it is to have a union presence to be able to keep staff in schools, because for teachers, apart from in specific curriculum areas like physics, music, the biggest issue isn't recruitment, it's retention. It's those people going in with a really rosy idea of what teaching can be, and it could be like that. I feel like it was like that when I started teaching. It was wonderful, and I really miss it. But what we need is, we need it to be like that, and we need those trade union recognition agreements in all MATs, including CLT. So if there are any councillors here who are governors, I know Councillor Ryan Stevenson, you're a chair of governors at one of the TGAT schools. If you can please ask and bring that on the table, that we can have trade union recognition agreements with those schools, so we can get in early and retain those important members of staff that are not replaceable. Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, that was the question. Can councillors who are on boards of who are governors, can they raise this with the other members of the governing board, with school leadership?
Any other questions from anybody? Councillor Pryor, you'd like to comment?
Yeah, Helen's absolutely right about school budgets at the moment. A medium-sized primary school will have had about £2 million cut from its budget since 2010. So this means even though teachers have been having below inflation pay rises, the government can't just say, well, give a pay rise out of that budget, because they've lost so much money already, directly money taken from children's education. So these pay rises for teachers are absolutely necessary, and they need to be funded by the government. It's a really important point. They just can't be taken out of existing budgets. And I think the points you're making about what the teaching profession is, it has changed drastically over the years, and it links to what Julie was saying about the status of teachers and the status of the profession. It's not just teaching anymore. Teachers are social workers. I know on the Scrutiny board we've talked about child poverty before. We've talked about the housing conditions that children are in. I know that some councillors have done incredible work on things like the uniform exchange, but families shouldn't be that poor that they need these things. It's fantastic that we're doing them, but it's a disgrace that we're in that position in the first place. And this just adds more and more pressure onto teachers. And it's at the same time we saw coming out of COVID that the teachers were frontline workers and doing an incredible job. They were going to work in the middle of the first lockdown when the virus was at its most rampant. And yet, coming out of COVID, it was often in the press that teachers were vilified and attacked. And I think it's really going to damage the profession. So teachers are being attacked in the media. They're having pay cuts. They're having increases in their workloads. It is something that just urgently needs tackling on every level.
Councillor Bowden next.
Yeah, I can speak to in some degree kind of anecdotally, and then I'll ask a question. So some years ago, I did a vocational course to be a primary school teacher, and I did a year, and I realised the workload then would have been far too much for what the pay would have been. And the statistic at the time, I don't know if it's changed or gotten worse or gotten better, but we were told, obviously, by university staff that 60% of newly qualified teachers leave within 5 years the profession completely. And so, yeah, just to sort of reiterate the problem, it's not necessarily recruitment; it's actually the retention of staff. It is a real concern. And then my experience as being a teaching assistant for 6 years, and then a high-level teaching assistant for 4 years. And I saw that even as a support staff, never mind a teacher. But as there was issues with recruitment and containing staff, what we ended up seeing is a higher workload then put on the staff that were remaining. And I guess my question is, what are we doing to address making sure that workload is achievable? Because if it isn't, then we're going to hemorrhage more staff leaving.
Erica?
The points you make are really valid. Some of that does not rest with the local authority. Some of that rests with central government, who do recognise that it's a very severe problem. So there have been two strands of work, particularly one around workload, where there's a workload reduction toolkit, which is available for staff and leaders to access. There's innovations such as the Oak Academy, whereby you can download material. There's a whole curriculum that will be planned for each subject. There's quite a lot of debate about the validity of that, but it still exists, or it's going to exist, so that there are moves to try and reduce workload in that way. In terms of retention as well, this is part of the whole government strategy. So there's been a lot of investment in early career teachers. So that's what used to be NQTs, newly qualified teachers, and that used to be a 1-year induction process. And then after that, you were kind of out into the full maelstrom of the teaching profession. Now it's a 2-year process. It's underpinned by a course and ECT modules that newer teachers have to take, and they get one-to-one mentor support during that time. So I'm not saying it's ideal, but the quality of the materials are really good, and much better than early career teachers have ever had before. And it is specifically to address the problem that it is the newer teachers who tend not to stay beyond 5 years. In Leeds, as much as we can do as an LA, I think in school improvement, we try very much to find ways to make teachers' life better, I suppose. So we have the head teacher support service. We have a head teacher induction program as well. So that's helped to help retain head teachers. Obviously, we have quite a series of networks as well in different subjects, so that you have the option of meeting other people teaching the same thing, or trying to devise a curriculum so that you can share good practice and therefore reduce your workload. Workload as well is a key feature of any Ofsted inspection. Regardless of whether it's a graded or ungraded inspection, inspectors have to ask teachers about workload and what leaders are doing to reduce workload. And nearly always they are thinking a lot about what they're doing. So there's quite a lot of whole class feedback is a new strategy, rather than marking book after book after book, where actually it's the same mistake and the same mistake. You tell the mistake. And in your ward, for instance, in Roundhay, I know that the Roundhay School have taken workload really seriously. And for instance, they have a golden week in the first week after a holiday, with the idea that there are no meetings and teachers can focus solely on getting back into teaching good quality lessons for their pupils.
Go ahead.
That was another question I was actually going to ask. So that is actually really good to hear that Ofsted, whether inspected or uninspected, that they're taking workload seriously. And I don't know if it has become policy now for Ofsted, but I did hear that a marker was going to be as well the well-being of staff. So I don't know if that's come in yet, but I know that I think along with workload is the idea of, well-being treated seriously would have been an indicator. So has that? Do we know if that's progressed any further?
I think it's ongoing. It's not come out yet, but well-being is taken extremely seriously across schools. I mean, I advise on quite a lot of head teacher performance management processes, and quite often staff well-being is part of an objective for a head teacher. So it's high profile and prominent.
Okay, we've got Councillor Bithell next.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just a really quick one. We've had mentioned this morning home growing young people into teacher roles. And I think one of the things that's worth adding to that is that the children are in the classrooms with the teachers, and actually they can absolutely tell that we are, well, I'm not anymore. I am one of those teachers that's left. But they can absolutely tell that we're not coping. So why would they? They get these people come in from other jobs and say, look how much fun you can have, look how great it is, because they just make one speech. And we're there at the back of the room yawning because we've been up till 11, 12 o'clock marking books, and they know. So actually, we aren't able to recruit young people into it until we get to the point where the teachers that are currently there are able to cope with their lives. And at the moment, I don't feel that a lot of teachers are able to cope. It's completely unmanageable. So it's really, really great to have this sort of discussion in Scrutiny this morning. And I really look forward to what's going to come out nationally. And I guess the question is whether you've heard anything about it or just do you agree?
Erica?
Can I just clarify, do I agree with what?
It's just to make it a question.
I think you're absolutely right about teachers not being an advert for teaching when they're clearly exhausted. And I've always believed that how can a teacher be their best if they're exhausted and stressed? I can remember the days when, going home and shouting at my own children in a way that I just wouldn't at any other person's child, because I was, I'd had it up to here. And I think it's having that brain space to be able to deal with other issues and problems as they occur in the classroom and outside the classroom that teachers need.
I have to say, you never looked stressed when you were teaching me, Erica, but perhaps I wasn't your troubled child. But
no, you were great.
You might have just lost the room. You've lost the room, Erica. Councillor Renshaw next.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask a bit more about the network and the support, and whether or not it is support that teachers get, or is it looked on sometimes as a weakness of that person? Because I do know people who are reluctant to go and say if they're having or feeling stressed due to the workload, because they're worried that it's going to be looked more on as a weakness of theirs. And sometimes it can be a clash of personalities with staffing. And then I just wondered if there were any difference between the retention of state schools and the retention and workload of those who are in academies. And I know there's many budget issues in academies due to the government funding that they receive, but state schools obviously receive their funding from Leeds City Council, is my understanding. So I just wonder if there are any difference in those figures that you could give us.
Julie?
I don't have any figures around that today, but it's certainly something that we could look to get you. Absolutely. I think just in relation to the point that you make about, again, well-being, I think that goes back to leadership. So again, it goes back to the role of a governing body. It goes back to the role of the leadership team. I think it's about culture. Again, it's not just, within any organisation, whether that's a school, whether that's children's social care, it's about leading from the top and modelling. I think that's where that commitment to restorative approaches and restorative practice is absolutely key. And I think creating an open culture where your colleagues feel able to express themselves freely within a safe, trusted environment is absolutely key. I think it's key for safeguarding, as well. Do you know what I mean? I think there's something about just having that open culture, but that does come from the top and it has to be modelled by the leadership team.
Tim, do you want to add
Can I
something?
just say on that though? I do think that sometimes it has to be an individual member of staff in a school has to get to the point of actually bursting before they will go and admit to their leadership team or management that they can't deal with what's going on in the classroom, because they feel obliged to carry out that duty and that duty of care to those children. So I think it's identifying and noticing that. So it's the leaderships, but they've got enough responsibility on their shoulders that are more and more pressures, because there's all the educational side of it, of things that we haven't yet come on to, that children have to deal with in schools, and teaching staff have to too.
I think it's about being observant, isn't it? I think it's about knowing your children, but knowing your staff, knowing your colleagues. I think there's something, as I've said, around managerial responsibility and leadership responsibility. I think there's also something about a culture of looking out for each other. You know, looking actually, how does your colleague look in the morning? How does your colleague look after coming out of teaching? Perhaps a particularly, challenging class. You know, so I think there's something about within that culture. I think it's setting the expectation of everybody, but that's not to take away the responsibility of leadership within that. You know, I think there is obviously supervision. You know, there's appraisal. I think in the current climate, where we do know that, again, staff right across the public sector, the resilience levels are low. They're being impacted themselves on a personal level by the cost of living crisis, as an example. Mental health. I think, now is the time where we need to be creating that space. You're absolutely right. And creating the opportunity and being proactive in doing that. So people do have the space to talk openly about how they feel.
Tim, would
But
you like?
in all fairness, Julie, if you look at any member of staff leaving a school when they feel that they've done their work that they could do, and you watch that, you look at the way that they are leaving that workplace, they look absolutely cream crackered and shattered. And it's the quality of life that they're having outside of the school that is, that we need to also take into account and consider, because they've all got families at home too.
Absolutely. And like Councillor Pryor, I've got family members, my sister's a teacher, so I can see that firsthand, so absolutely.
Tim, we're very expecting now something.
I've forgotten what I was going to say, Councillor Stevenson. If I can, just an observation on some of the other comments made by Councillor Renshaw. So since 2018-19, the DFE have been moving towards a national funding formula, and we're not quite there yet. So we do have a degree of discretion in Leeds to set our own funding formula. We've been working with schools in Leeds and the Schools Forum, and are moving as close as we possibly can to the national funding formula. But I guess the key point that I want to make is, in terms of that funding formula that we established for schools in Leeds, that is absolutely predominantly pupil-led, but not exclusively pupil-led. That formula applies equally to maintained and to academy schools. So there is no difference in the funding based on whether a school is maintained or an academy. It's exactly the same characteristics that are fed into the formula. It's exactly the same total that we get as part of the dedicated schools grant, and schools are treated equally whether maintained or academy in terms of the funding allocation.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. Councillor Harland, the report does mention the youth service. Do you want to make a couple of comments before we take final questions?
Yeah, certainly. It's in there. Apologies for being late, Chair. I left Kippax at 8:25 this morning, and there was an accident on the A64, which I've had a lovely trip round Bermontoffs and Hare Hills as well, though, after being redirected. The report, the bit in the report about the youth work retention is pretty straightforward. The youth working training has been advertised, and I think we had over a total of 30 applicants for that, and a shortlist of 18, I believe, Julie, that we're going to start interviewing shortly. We do understand, as a member myself, how valued youth work is across the city and across the political divide. And we'll do everything we can. But I'm happy to ask, rather than hold you up, I'm happy to answer questions via email if anybody's got anything. Thank you.
we were all sat in that traffic jam, I think, so don't worry. I have 3 questions from Andrew, Tony, and then Helen. So we'll go Andrew first.
Yes, sorry, I think, Karen, I think you touched on a couple of points that I was going to make, but I was just going to ask, Erica, would you honestly say, hand on heart, that you see Ofsted's focus on well-being as part of that wider regime as being a force for good?
Well, yes. I mean, I have to say a conflict of interest in that I am a practicing Ofsted inspector, so I would say that. But truly, yes, I do believe that. Yesterday I was on inspection and it was an ungraded inspection, so it looks particularly at subjects, but it has then 4 spotlight areas. One of those spotlight areas is workload, and we made sure that we asked a variety of teachers about their workload, if there are things like too many data, if heads are asking for too many data inputs during the year, for instance, that can affect the leadership and management judgment. And we do report back in every report about workload. So.
Yeah, I mean, just in my discussions with the teachers, I would totally disagree with that, because I would say what teachers say to me and do say to me is that actually on the day we will perform, because we're not going to score a home goal, and we're not going to, if we've got something to say about well-being and workload, we know that Ofsted is not the place to start talking about that. And, we do have a very open culture where I work in talking about those things. But I think what teachers would say to me, and I would agree with them, that actually, if we're expecting delivery of that Ofsted framework in all of those other aspects around quality of education, etc., that actually that focus on well-being is an absolute tick box. And that most teachers will actually perform for their school on the day and say the right things to Ofsted about their workload. But that doesn't negate the fact that day to day and term to term, they largely feel, even the most positive and the most experienced of teachers, many of whom I feel I work with, would say they feel absolutely up to here. But that doesn't correlate with what they will say to Ofsted on the day to try and do the best by their children in their schools.
Councillor Pryor.
I think some of the issues that, and I completely recognise what you're saying about Ofsted inspections, but I think some of the issues there aren't necessarily the inspections themselves, but they're some of what could be seen by some as punishments by the government, depending on what Ofsted result you get. So if you get an inadequate, obviously the government will force an academy order on the school, whether the school wants it or not. They're starting to talk about forcing academy orders onto schools if they get multiple RIs. And I think those conditions that the government has put on the Ofsted report has potentially led to, as you're saying, teachers feeling they need to put on a good show and defend the school in a way that actually, if the government took Ofsted seriously, teachers could be far more honest and open and reflective of what the experience of teaching is. So I think some of that isn't necessarily to do with the inspection itself. I think that the change in focus on Ofsted and wellbeing is a positive one. I know Ofsted have started looking a lot more closely at things like off-rolling as well, which I think is really important they look at. So these are the right things for them to focus on. It's just what happens with the report after that I think has altered behaviours.
And I wouldn't disagree with that. And I think some of the things that actually, in an ideal world, I think that the slant of the framework now is better than it has been for a very long time. I think the timescales with which schools have been expected to get this in place are a bit unreasonable when we think of the period that we've had. I don't disagree with that, but equally, I think what a lot of staff also say is that they recognise that a lot of the things that cause them stress are issues that are slightly out of their hands and even out of the leadership's hands. If, for example, I consider the environment I work in, I would say probably the number one pressure and stressing factor at the moment is issues around SEND. And those issues that they are dealing with around that are not within our gift. We're struggling with issues that actually we cannot practically. Somebody else needs to do something about that. Other systems need to be in place for us to do about that. And I think that is the other exacerbating factor on teachers and schools.
Erica, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but when we talk about Ofsted and the questions, do Ofsted look at how it's evidenced previously, i.e. is there a history of wellbeing concerns recorded in the school and then how the school's dealt with it? as opposed to, because Andrew's got a point, if the staff aren't going to tell you if it thinks they're going to get inadequate at the end, but surely Ofsted are looking at the evidence and how it's dealt with beforehand. Is that correct?
No, it is mainly by asking teachers and asking them for, what are the strategies that the school and leaders have implemented. So you wouldn't look at records of well-being for a member of staff, for instance. You might investigate if you've got large turnover, large absence rates, for instance. You might have a look at what leaders are doing about that. But I don't think you could look individually at members of staff.
Okay. Tony next.
I taught for 32 years, from everything from secondary modern to sixth form colleges. And one of the things that struck me is I never thought, there were 40 odd years ago when I started teaching, that I would say this. I'm glad I'm out of it. And part of the reason is because over those years, I've seen teachers undervalued by government, by governors, by management committees, and even probably more importantly, by parents. And I think that's where we're going to have the biggest problem, convincing people that teaching and social work, which we discussed earlier, are valuable professions to be in and do a valuable job in this society, because without them, the society would fall down. But what have I seen? I've seen in those years the status has disappeared, that the wages, cost of living has increased and wages have declined, that we're still in actual fact, we are not valuing teachers, we are not valuing things. To me, that's the key. How do we show teachers that they are valued? How do we show teachers that they're not just a bureaucratic instrument, but they're doing something good in educating children? That's the big question to me.
Helen, do you want to pose your final question first, then we'll do a wrap up at the end?
Yeah, I've got two questions. First, just to say that coming back on Councillor Renshaw, as unions, when a workplace is unionised and it has reps, staff will often come to those reps earlier than they would go to leadership. And so that's a good way of addressing staff well-being and picking up on problems earlier in the day, which can escalate and lead to staff leaving. And also to say that I know a lot of heads carry out staff well-being surveys, but the difficulty is staff are not being honest in those surveys, because they know that their answers can go back to their email address. So they know that they tell us regularly that we're not honest in these surveys, or we don't fill them in because what's the point? But so my two questions are, the first one is, how much data gathering and input is classed as too much by Ofsted? And secondly, how are head teachers advised to address health and well-being? Because I think some head teachers are doing the best they can. Others, rather than asking the staff what would help them, they may put on a yoga evening, which takes more time. They may say, let's all go bowling. Staff don't really want things that take more time. They want to be asked themselves, and they want to have more time to be able to do their job, so they've got a better work-life balance. So they're my two questions.
I'm very conscious that Erica's here as a member of the council staff, so we don't want to put you on the spot and speak for Ofsted. So I think broader responses, if needed, can be given. Is there anybody who wants to?
I suppose just in response to the question about leadership again, and I suppose I'd just like to go back to the earlier point that Erica made around our school improvement team, and actually the role that they have in supporting the recruitment of new head teachers, but also providing that induction and that support. clearly, as part of the, their assistance, if you like, there is that absolute focus on well-being and on creating that culture within a school where people do feel able and empowered to be honest, and for that to be treated respectfully, and for senior leaders, I suppose, to recognise their role in responding to that. So that is a feature, and more so now, as we've already talked, in terms of the current climate and the current conditions, all the more that we need to have those open cultures in all of our organisations. So I know that's something that the Learning Improvement team do focus on. I was maybe just going to come back to the previous point as well, just in relation to status, if you like, and valuing, whether it's social workers, whether it's teaching staff. And again, just going back to the National Review of Children's Social Care, that's when you look at the recommendations, that's the Josh McAllister review, he's very clear in terms of establishing a new career framework for social workers. And within that, looking at progression, looking at salaries. So a national approach for the first time ever, really, in relation to that career progression, that career pathway, that remuneration and acknowledgement of the role that social workers play in society, which I think is a positive development.
Councillor Venner, do you want to make a closing remark?
Yeah, thank you. The recruitment crisis has ended up largely focusing on education, and I just wanted to make the point that this crisis is across the whole of the public sector. So within social care, it's affecting all areas. It's affecting early years, social workers, social work assistants, youth work, and for the same reasons. So lack of status, incredibly negative press coverage. I was really proud when we got our Ofsted report, not least because it enabled us to talk really publicly about positive social work practice. It's very rare that social workers are in the press for positive, reasons. And there's also really, really chronic underfunding of the sector, which affects terms and conditions and morale. And each part of the sector has different challenges. So within early years, there's a chronic recruitment crisis. It's mainly due to terrible underfunding of the sector, but also they felt hugely neglected nationally over the last few years. Guidance for early years in COVID came out even later for earlier settings than it did for schools. They couldn't access the same funding schools could for things like cleaning. They were told to stay open when Boris said schools were vectors of transmission. There are lots of reasons why we're struggling to recruit staff, and it's really important that we champion Leeds and we champion our services as great places to work. But it's also really important that in the different roles that we have, we do the awareness raising, the lobbying and the campaigning that we can do around this, because the independent review that Julie's just referenced, that Josh McAllister led, is really clear that children's social care needs a complete reset. But he also caveats by saying you cannot achieve this without more funding and without tackling child poverty. So as well as doing everything we can to recruit and retain our staff, we also do need to be constantly kind of raising awareness of why we're in the situation we're in. Thank you.
Okay, we have 4 recommendations on the paper. The first is that we are asked to note the challenges involved with recruitment and retention in relation to children and families workforce, which we have done, if a nod. The second is that we're asked to note the ongoing efforts of children and families to address these have been outlined this morning. We're happy to note that. C gives us a choice. We were asked to decide if we either maintain a watching brief of the progress against the broader strategy, as we have done with the child poverty strategy approach, or to focus on elements to incorporate into the work schedule, so effectively a deep dive into other areas. Is there any preference among the board into which of those you'd rather do? I think, what page are we on here, Angela? The actual recommendations? 13. So they're pretty different. Yes, Councillor Forsyth.
Just a point with this, in terms of the workload for the officers, do we need to take that into account as to which of these 2 we actually choose?
It's largely up to the board to determine. The background being, of course, we have already had an informal working group meeting in September already on it, so you may wish just to keep a watching brief, as we do with child poverty report. If I propose that as a way forward, is everybody happy? Yep. Okay, that's resolved then. And the final recommendation is that we're asked to consider how best to support the directorate in its efforts to recruit and retain children and family workforce. And I think we heard the plea from Councillor Venner at the end in terms of the Leeds approach. So I guess as a board, it would be up to Councillor Lamb as chair in future, but I guess we collectively would try and support you in that endeavour as best we can as a scrutiny board. Any further comments on the recommendations? No. Okay, well, that finishes that item. Thank you very much, Erica, Tim, for your input this morning. And are we happy to plough straight through, or would you like a break? Councillor Renshaw.
Thank you. Sorry, Chair, but I'd like to ask some questions on youth service if it's still possible, because we didn't seem to move on away from schools. We just seem to.
Well, I gave the opportunity for more questions, but Councillor.
I'm happy to meet with you on a one-to-one, Karen.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Harlan. Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying in March, Karen, we do have a specific item on youth service. So if it's anything, in the meantime, at our next meeting, if there's anything that you want to report back to the board, I'm sure the board would be happy to hear that. Thank you very much, Councillor Harland. The intention is to finish at 12:30. So unless anybody's desperate for another mince pie, we shall carry on through. So our next item 8. Last year, we considered and welcomed the emerging draft version of the new Leeds Send and Inclusion Strategy and agreed to maintain a watching brief surrounding the implementation of the new strategy. So we have 2 colleagues with us this morning, and we shall ask them to introduce themselves once they are seated. Okay, Natalie and Sally, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Good morning, members. My name is Natalie Samuel and I work as part of Val's Learning Inclusion team.
And good morning, everybody. I'm Sally Townend, Designated Clinical Officer for SEND. So that's a delegated role from Leeds ICB to ensure all health providers are delivering on the SEND agenda.
Okay, Val, are you leading on this? Do you want to start us off?
Happy just to say a few words and then I'll hand over to Val. So essentially the report updates on our co-production of the Leeds Send strategy, which is everyone's included. It aims to improve the experience and outcomes for children and young people aged 0 to 25 who do have social and emotional needs and special education needs and disability. The draft did come here previously and it's subsequently been approved at the SEND partnership. We're going to have a presentation and some more information this morning, which will detail the journey to co-produce the strategy that we've been on, and especially the work that we've done with children and young people, families and partners to get the strategy to where it is today. We will also talk about governance and implementation arrangements for the strategy, and within that, the real commitment to a partnership approach. Finally, just in terms of the recommendations, it's really asking for Scrutiny to support the communications around the strategy and the implementation of the strategy. And also, I suppose, really to consider the feedback that we've had from children and young people, which was, it's really important for leaders and people with influence to speak up for inclusion. So I'll hand over to Val.
First of all, thank you, and thank you for inviting us back to give you an update of where we are with the strategy. As Julie said, we brought the draft to this board. We took the feedback that came from this board and included that within the strategy. We have been working throughout the COVID period on this strategy. As you would imagine, we have had some difficulties in that absolute determination to co-produce the strategy from where it was, simply because of the COVID measures that were in place. But we are really, really pleased to say that the amount of engagement that we have had that has been from children, from families, from across all agencies has been absolutely fantastic. We had more than 30,000 hits basically when we were putting the strategy out on various networks through the local offer, talking to forums, talking to groups, surveys that were undertaken. So we really do feel that we've had enormous amounts of feedback that we have received in that way of you said we did. So we've taken the information that families, young people gave us and turned that into the strategy. What we also then did is look at the Send Green paper. As you will know, we have been waiting for the review of the Send system for quite some time now. The consultation came out earlier this year that was around the Send Green paper. We looked then at the recommendations within the Send Green paper and the direction of travel nationally, and we aligned that with the strategy within Leeds and what those children and those young people told us. We are really, really pleased to say that a lot of what is in the Green Paper absolutely aligns with where we are with Leeds and what our young people said, what the families said, and also a lot of the work that we've already started to put into place within Leeds. What also, following on from our last scrutiny meeting, happened with the government was that they also put out a new framework for consultation, which was around Send inspection. That framework was open to consultation. Consultation has closed around it. And just yesterday, we got the finalised framework that will be used to inspect local areas. So that is not just an inspection of the local authority, but an inspection of the whole area. So that includes health colleagues, it includes social care, it includes education within the settings and how Send is delivered. It includes third sector, looking at how they're involved and invited to be part of the whole picture. Most importantly, the focus within that Send inspection is very, very much on the outcomes of young people, and that's holistic outcomes of young people and what those children, those young people are telling us about the services holistically, the pathways that are around special educational needs within the whole area. So it's a real focus that is listening to the reality of the situation that is around and those lived experiences, rather than as previously, where it was a huge focus that was on actually compliance with some of the new legislation that was around. So it's a different focus. As I say, the framework came out yesterday. So of course we all grabbed it and scanned it and had a look to see whether there's any significant changes to what was in the consultation. There doesn't look like there's significant changes. It's very much following that same pathway. So it is absolutely in line with where we're going with our strategy. Really pleased that what we've got for you this morning is a presentation which is looking at how we've actually started to work on the strategy. So whilst it isn't yet published, it should be published in the next couple of weeks or so. We have not been just sat back waiting, because we know that children, young people, families, there is so much demand that is out there, that rising demand that's out there. So we have been working on those priorities. And what we'd like to do is take you through a presentation where we look at those priorities and the work that's already being undertaken at the moment. The thing that I would like to say just on the back of the conversation that we've just had in terms of workforce, a massive issue here in terms of capacity. And that is right the way across from learning inclusion services, local authority, social care, health colleagues, schools themselves and the capacity in schools to be able to take on the additional responsibilities, and also to put, you know, all of the support they know is needed for those young people with SEND and with disabilities into schools. So I just wanted to sort of link that into the conversation that we've just had, because whilst we've got the strategy and absolutely so much engagement within the strategy, the issue is about the delivery of it and the capacity to deliver it. We know our capacity is not within our teams that sit within the local authority, it's actually out there in schools. So what we've done is an awful lot of work to support schools, to enable them, so that we are giving them the support that they need at the time that they need it. And the feedback so far with some of the work we've done around SEND practice framework, which I know my colleagues will talk about, has actually received an awful lot of support and thanks that have come back in of how we have co-produced things and worked together with SENCOs. So I'm really pleased that we've got Natalie here, who is from my service, from Learning Inclusion, but also we've got Sally here, Sally Townsend, because that is very much about the link across into health, our designated clinical officer, where we can show how we are co-producing and working together. Okay.
Okay, so we've got the presentation, I think. Board members have it in paper form as well, but it's going to go on the screen. So over to Natalie.
Fortunately, Val's already covered a good chunk of the presentation for us. So if we just skip to the next slide, please, Angela, thank you. Just putting some numbers there, as Val's been talking about co-production there, just putting a few numbers on that. It is very challenging for us to co-produce meaningfully with children and young people, with families, with practitioners across learning, health, care settings, the voluntary sector, in a global pandemic when people were locked down. A lot of our usual forums, means for doing that and connecting with children and young people, particularly children and young people with additional needs and communication needs, that has been very challenging. So we you have taken longer to do this work perhaps than we might have liked to do, and there have also been significant delays in the national picture, as Val was saying. So that green paper, that was actually postponed in its publication 3 times during the period that we've been co-producing the strategy. But we are there now, and we are, as Val says, very happy to be publishing, and we have not delayed in terms of the work. We are now either in the implementation stages or final planning stages of the key areas of work for us. Next slide, Angela. So you've seen these priorities before at last time you met, and also are in the pack. What we want to do today, just very briefly, because we're aware that time is tight. You've seen this so far as a theoretical thing, as words on a page, as some nice diagrams, but we'd like to describe the work that's actually happening. So you can see in terms of reality of practice that's happening in schools and settings, and how we're going to hopefully move forward with this. And a lot of it is, as Val was saying, responding to challenges that you've been discussing this morning, and how can we make some positive changes that will impact there. So if we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Angela. Val just mentioned this, our SEND and inclusion practice framework, and this is, we hope, going to be a key vehicle for positive change here. So this is all about 3 of our most key areas, our priorities. Identification and assessment of need. If we get that right early, it makes an enormous difference to outcomes for these children and young people. So that needs to be undertaken by a skilled, confident professional workforce who have the knowledge and skills around what makes for a quality, holistic assessment of needs. How do we provide early support and plan really effective early support for children and young people? That is critical in terms of outcomes for that child or young person. We know that when we meet needs earlier, outcomes are better, but it also has a huge impact on those more specialist services later on, because if children's needs aren't met early, they very often will become more complex. The family will start to suffer across the family from the impact of those needs not being met. More and more services will then be required to pick up the pieces later. So early intervention here is really critical, and we need to have a workforce that feels skilled and confident about providing that early support. So the practice framework is all about bringing our practitioners together. We have some excellent practice in schools in years, some really, really good practice across the city. And we want to bring the workforce together to build something that will be of real practical use, real tools and resources to be shared across all our schools and settings to support that consistent quality practice. So it's bringing together a suite of resources, practical examples. What does a quality assessment look like? What does a quality plan look like? How do you enable children and young people to have a voice in that plan? It would also provide access to expertise in that community of schools locally. So who can you reach out to if you want some advice and support around a particular issue, a particular type of SEND need? It's vital that it doesn't come from us in the local authority sitting in a room saying, this is how you do good practice. This needs to come from our practitioners in the city so that they can have that trust and investment in it. So as Val says, we've started to bring practitioners together. I had the privilege of talking to a large group of SENCOs, special educational needs coordinators, just very recently at the university, who were studying and very committed SENCOs. Quite a few of them had been involved in some of the early workshops, and I shall be frank and say a few of them said that they were really sceptical about it, but actually had really positive experience and felt that it was going to be something that would actually make their jobs easier and make it quicker and easier. It's really interesting. We talk about the huge pressures on the workforce, and there are myriad reasons that you've all raised this morning around that. But what is frustrating is that we do see costs to people's time and duplication that aren't necessary and that we can get rid of if we have tools like this to help us. A great example of this, just the other day, talking to a colleague who deals with funding applications. She said, I regularly receive funding applications that are 10 or 12 pages long, and all the salient information is in the first 2. What a waste of those critical professionals' time. That's the SENCO. It's potentially a health worker like a GP. You know, it's those really costly to services to produce those kind of things. If they knew that, if they had examples in front of them, if they had a colleague they could connect with in another school who's really hot on doing those funding applications, things can start to get a little bit easier. So it's just trying to identify the ways that we can support the workforce, but also work more efficiently and cut out things that just trip us up, really. So that's a really key project for us, and we're quite excited about that one. The next slide, if you would. Part of that, connected to that, practice framework, is around quality early support plans, because that's really critical. But we need to have quality plans for children and young people across the continuum of support. So we have children and young people with very complex needs. They're a very small minority of our children and young people, but in a big city, that's still a significant number, about 5,000 children who have very complex needs, which mean they need specialist support across education, across health and across care. Those quality plans, given the level of need and the complexity of need there, we need to make sure they're really high quality as well. We've seen a radical rise in demand for those education, health and care plans. Talked earlier in this meeting about falling primary school roles. It's important to note that the population of children and young people with SEND and those with the most complex needs is continuing to increase. So there are various reasons we could unpick around that, but this is a growing population, and we're particularly seeing communication needs, that's autism, social, emotional, and mental health needs have been 2 of the most rising areas of need. So having the capacity across our teams to deal with those plans, and again, to work on them really efficiently, because they've got doctors involved in those plans. We've got our SENCOs, the school workers, the local authority doing all that really well, and doing it efficiently and effectively is also critical within this and part of our strategy. We are also, as one of our key priorities, we are putting a real focus on children and young people who have SEND but are also in other vulnerable circumstances. So, for example, around 50% of our children looked after in the city and 40% of our children in need have identified special needs, but there will be others amongst them who do not. So these children and young people are potentially facing multiple disadvantages. Around 33, I think it is, a third of our children and young people accessing, who have SEND access free school meals. but whereas there are only 20% of their peers accessing free school meals. So again, children and young people who are in financial disadvantage, there is that correlation with SEND as well. So we see children and young people here who are facing multiple vulnerabilities. And we know that those children and young people may be at risk of permanent exclusion. Often we see a high frequency of that. We know those children and young people are more vulnerable to criminal activity, to criminal exploitation, to sexual exploitation. Getting in early there is key. And a lot of our work is going to be around how do we identify those potential vulnerable children and young people earlier and act quicker to identify if there are needs, if there are problems, and what are we doing about it. A key part of this that's exciting is the SAFE task force. So this is part of a national pilot programme that we in Leeds are taking part in. And this is all part of the government's beating crime agenda. So it's around looking at specific hotspots in a city or area where there's a lot of criminal activity and seeing and working with children and young people in that area who may be vulnerable to really focus on making sure they're engaged positively in education, making sure they're engaged in positive activities, that they've got access to support like learning mentors, and making sure that their aspirations are being guided and encouraged, and they've better options to work towards. So that's a really key piece of work that we are very glad to be involved in as a national pilot. Is it 3 years and 3.7 million, I think, of funding. So it's a good addition to our offer in the city. I'll just say very quickly, and I'll hand over to Sally. One of the other key aspects of this is developing the local offer of provision. So I've just mentioned that rising population. We do not have adequate capacity in our schools, particularly our specialist schools, to provide for those rising needs unless we develop the offer we have. We've already opened 160 new specialist school places this year through expanding existing specialist provision. We have another 200 coming online next year with a new free school specialist school for the city. So that's going to be enormously helpful. We have another bid in for funding for the following years to build another, but we're also looking more widely at the offer of provision. We've had our first major careers fair this year for children and young people with SEND, our Next Steps event, which doesn't just look at supported employment and what local employers can offer in terms of support for those with additional needs, but we looked at a whole range of other issues about preparing for adulthood, independent living, housing, managing a budget, all those things that could be a bit more challenging for young people when they've got additional needs. That was really successful, 2,000 young people through the door, and our employment skills teams have committed to deliver that again next year, and many of the young people are doing follow-up activities from that. We've also identified employers who are exploring offering supported internships, and those things are so valuable. We've delivered 2 supported internships ourselves within our own learning inclusion service newly this year. So lots of activity going on. I could talk about that for hours, but I won't. I will pass over to Sally now.
Okay, thank you, Natalie.
Next slide.
Next slide, yeah. Thank you. So obviously we've been kind of developing our local offer of provision. You've covered that slide. It's the next slide, isn't it? I was thinking. Okay, that's not fine. Yeah, that's the right slide, yeah. So one of the priorities we set out in the strategy for phase 1 is to look at the pathways specifically for those with social communication difficulties and autism, so known as the neurodevelopmental pathway. And we see this as a priority. It's something that's reported back from our families and the children and young people themselves as a priority in the city. And also, I think it's kind of reflected in that's where we've got a lot of the long waiting list for the diagnostic pathways. And the feedback we're getting is that's fine that we've got those kind of diagnostic pathways, but what about the support while we're waiting for that assessment? And that kind of diagnostic pathway in the label doesn't change the needs those children still have. So what we've got now through this strategy is a really shared commitment to view across the agencies those pathways, but with a clear understanding that we want to ensure early access to the support when the child and young person and families require that support. So the focus is going to be on ensuring early access to the support, but still have those diagnostic pathways available to them at the appropriate time when they are required, but making sure they're supported on that journey. And the work for that is progressing, and some really positive steps have been taken on that. The other thing that's really, I think the pandemic has really highlighted is, which our city have got a really well-informed, trauma-informed approach. And through the Compassionate Leeds strategy, we're looking at reducing the impact of the adverse childhood experiences. There is a really strong coalition between the ACEs and those adverse childhood experiences known as the ACEs and children with SEND. So we need to ensure we're kind of embedding that strategy along with the Future in Mind strategy into this SEND strategy and all the kind of phases of work we do from the implementation of this strategy. And we've got a real commitment to that, again, across agencies. Next slide, please. So what's next? So I feel like over the last few months, we've really made some really good progress as far as getting that real partnership working. We've worked on strengthening the government's arrangements across education, health and care, and making it everybody's business, because it really does need to be everybody's business across all sectors. We've been, it was actually yesterday, but we did a previous one. We've been to the Children and Young People's Population Board and completed a deep dive and SEND. And that has resulted in commitment to support implementation of this strategy across the agencies. So that's really positive. We're kind of getting engagement of senior leaders with this strategy and implementation framework. Work is progressing on strengthening our implementation group, ensuring those implementation groups has a real multi-agency involvement. So work is continuing on that to make sure we've got all the right people involved in those implementation groups. But we've also identified we need those supported by a quality assurance group and a data group. Especially for the data, I think it's been highlighted that is a gap. Our specific data across Leeds, across agencies on that SEND population is quite poor. And that's something we really need to strengthen and develop a shared outcomes framework, but then be able to see as we implement this strategy, what differences are we making, what changes to that data? Are we meeting the outcomes we set out in that shared outcomes framework? And then we're looking to obviously report back on the work and the progress we're making on the implementation of the strategy. I'm proposing we do that through the SEND Partnership Board, but also the Children and Young People's Population Board. So they're kind of where we're at and what our next steps are. So just hand it over to any questions.
That as well, that we should probably have added to the slide. I should have added the communications element next as well, and that's where we would really ask for the support of the board. Once we're publishing the strategy, making sure that it is being shared widely and that there's this support. Children and young people did, as Val was saying, they were really keen that people across the city were promoting inclusion more, talking about the needs of children with SEND more. Some of them said, you know, a lot of other groups who face discrimination, there's often big social media campaigns around that. There's never anything around us. You know, it's not sexy basically to have special needs, learning disabilities. No one wants to get involved in that. So they really want to see people with influence talking about these issues. And there is still a lot of issues around stigma and discrimination sometimes for young people. So that was one of their asks of the board today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the detailed presentation. We have Councillor Renshaw who's going to kick us off with questions.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered what whether or not you were recruiting any more staff to deliver this strategy, how it was going to impact and reduce the inequalities in school. I was here at the Parliament, the Young People's Parliament, a couple of weeks ago, and heard about the inequalities that they feel firsthand, just simple accessing the way into the city, what was in place for them in their everyday life, and how they were discriminated against within communities. And then I wondered what time scale it was going to narrow between CAMS and the referrals to CAMS for any young person who has got any mental health issues, which was mentioned in that framework. So if you could answer all those questions, I'd be thankful.
Val?
So I can answer some of those questions, and then I might have to turn to colleagues when it's about CAMS, etc., and some of the other work that's going on. So in terms of learning inclusion, in terms of how we're going to be supporting schools that are out there and settings, early years settings and schools, yes, we have acquired some additional funding. So we have had conversations with all of our schools at Schools Forum, which are about this agenda and the SEND agenda. And within the designated schools grant block, there is the high needs block. And what we have looked at is funding that comes from that to actually employ additional staff. It's an invest save proposal, which would be about putting that support into schools at that earliest level, earliest intervention level, that then prevents the needs escalating and rising, and therefore having recourse to an education, health and care plan and specialist support. So it's about that investor save model, where if we can put the support in at the right time, it stops that reduction, it reduces the need, so it stops the escalation that's around it. So we have done that. We're in that process now of recruitment to that. We have talked to unions, we've got approval from unions, and we're now in that recruitment process of that additional staff. And that's about building that capacity in school when we're talking about that workforce development and the workforce support that sits around it. We're very aware about the inequalities in schools. Lots of young people tell us about that, and it's their access not to just the activities that are during the day within a school, it's outside of school activities as well. What we've had to do in terms of capacity is prioritise at this moment in time some of the activities that we're undertaking with the SEND strategy. So whilst, yes, all the priorities cover all of the things that you've just mentioned about, at this point in time, our first priorities are some of the work that's about the COVID recovery and working on the trauma informed and supporting young people with that level of anxiety and back into school. So we're having to focus some of our priorities and our energies basically into specific priorities at this moment in time in phase 1. And then in phase 2, we can move on to some of the other priorities. I'm going to pass over to colleagues.
Just to add a little bit in terms of the issues around discrimination, and I wouldn't want to suggest those aren't big issues. I work closely with children and young people. I volunteer with children and young people with SEND, have done for many years, and I'm not going to negate those issues at all. We are working on it actively now. We have a new SEND Youth Forum, which has grown. It was established during the pandemic, so again, not an easy time to be encouraging children who may be nervous of communicating, maybe not socially confident, to get involved in something new. But we've increased that from just 3 young people initially to now 50 who engage in a range of activities. They always have options to come together for meetings, and we want to grow that. And again, that's something you can support with us. But that's particularly key about making sure those aren't segregated activities and that there's a link between that SEND Youth Forum and the other youth forums in the city. It's got to be inclusive. Yes, sometimes they want something special and different, same with the careers fair, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be promoting access to all the universal activities. Another thing we're doing around the play activities, young people, again, this was from young people's voice. So the things we're doing in the strategy, because they have said it's their priorities, the careers fair was a response to them saying that was their number one, and the increased improved careers advice in schools around SEND, so we're working on that one as well. The other thing they said was around play provision, that they don't always get opportunities to try things out. And again, for children who aren't socially confident or who are struggling with transport, which is an issue for a lot of our young people generally, that they wanted a commitment to do some work there. So we have been working to bring together some activity days. Schools will do that within the school day and bring their learners to those activity days, where we'll offer a range of activities. One of our commission suppliers who delivers something called short breaks. Short breaks, previously respite care, but they're also supposed to be really fun activities for kids while their parents have a break from caring. Scope, our provider there, is also offering some taster sessions for young people so they can try out activities that they're not confident about just walking straight into, and they can have a bit of extra support to try something out before they then, perhaps if they enjoy it, can then start doing it in a more universal capacity in their local community. So there's loads more we'd love to do there, and we will, as Val says, we've got to prioritise a bit. But the other question was around CAMS, and I think that's your area more.
Yeah, I mean, as you can all imagine, especially following the pandemic, where health services, we had staff kind of redeployed in areas to cope with the pandemic, plus then coming out of the pandemic, we've had increasing demand on services like CAMS. As far as the work that's being done there, our ICB are what they call pathway integration officers now, were commissioners, are working very closely with providers to look at the services they're currently offering, demand, other ways of delivering those services. As far as mental health support, some of you might be aware we've got MindMate support teams that support mental health within schools. In January, they're being rolled out, increased, so more schools will get coverage from those. Regarding the neurodiversity, more specifically in that diagnostic pathway, that is probably where they've had, especially for the MindMate SPA, the biggest increase of number of referrals. So as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at that pathway, how can we provide support earlier? And on providing that support on the MindMate website, we've already got what we're calling the ND Information Hub. So it's somewhere parents can go, children, young people themselves, and find information out that might support them early on in that journey. Alongside that, the West Yorkshire ICB are doing a deep dive and work around the neurodiversity and the pathways, kind of pre-diagnostic pathway and post-diagnostic pathway. And it's kind of because it's recognised this diagnostic pathway of the ASD, ADHD, that neurodiversity group is a national issue at the moment, and the numbers increasing. But the West Yorkshire are doing this deep dive, and that is to see if there's any areas of it or any parts of it we can do at scale at West Yorkshire level. So they're the kind of different parts of work that are going on to try and address the kind of challenges we have in mental health and CAMS.
You've got a follow-up, Councillor Renshaw.
Yeah, Chair, thank you. Nobody really answered the question over the waiting time to get seen by CAMS, which comes following all those processes. I'd like to thank the South-East youth team who do a lot of work which is very inclusive and addressing mental health issues, and those people who are very shy and suffering from anxiety and other forms of mental health. But nobody's really said how long the waiting time is. Once you do get referred, which is a long process, how long it is before you can actually see somebody.
Depends which area CAMS you're talking about. I haven't got the figures with me. Definitely MindMate SPA, there is for the triage, when with 6 months waiting list for that to be triaged, they recognise that's a real issue. The ND waiting list at the moment, I'm not sure the exact figures. I'd have to go back to the ICB colleagues that manage those waiting lists. In Leeds, I know we're managing them by going out to clinical partners to do some of those assessments for ND assessments. That is recognised as not a really satisfactory consistent offer for those assessments, because you've got some done in CAMS, some by those clinical partners. So that is something they're kind of currently looking at, and how can we meet that demand in different ways.
Ask if those figures can be brought to the scrutiny board as soon as possible, because initially they were doing like a catch up with CAMS and narrowing the waiting time, and then due to the pandemic, but there's more and more people now, with young people with mental health issues, and more are being identified in primary schools. So the sooner you identify that and refer on to CAMS, the quicker that issue gets dealt with. And I'd just like to think that some form of catch-up programme was in place to address those mental health issues that may fester and go on to be bigger issues as they get older.
I think Vala wants to comment, sorry, on that.
Just to say that I think it would be really useful if we did have a look at the Future in Mind programme, because that whole programme and that strategy encompasses a lot of the areas that we're talking about now, with the action plan that sits alongside it. And that has got a data bank as well. So we could look at that if it's something that members would like to do, and actually bring some more information. It would be through the Future in Mind programme that we could do that.
I think if the data is available that Councillor Renshaw requested, if it can be shared through Angela, and then it can be emailed, and then if we want to pick it up Councillor Renshaw in then further meetings, it would be quite useful. One final comment then.
Can I just clarify, is it the CAMS as a whole, or is it specifically the neurodiversity you want to look at? Is it mental health support?
I'd say both.
Both. Yeah. Both.
Yeah, both,
Because it's
please.
also the mental health support isn't just about CAMS either. It's about the support that's available in third sectors, in clusters, mind-mate support teams. There's a whole kind of package of different mental health
And I do know a
support.
lot that won't go on to MindMate because they won't admit that they've got that problem. So they need that referral to CAMS in the first place, which they have to get done to the GP.
I think actually a briefing note are quite useful, because I know there's a lot of different arms to this, and many councils will sit on clusters, and we had our cluster meeting in the Outer North East on yesterday morning, and I know the NHS is supporting clusters as well now, with a sort of an element before it gets to MindMate, and all these different things can be quite confusing, so a brief that could be circulated would be quite useful.
And I think, as Val suggested, I think actually for you to kind of look at the Future in Mind strategy with that kind of Future in Mind board would give you that bigger overview. But in the meantime, I can ask my ICP colleagues to provide that update to see what information
We'll capture that in the work schedule. Thank you. Andrew, next.
Just in relation to that, in terms of an on-the-ground experience, this week, I would agree with your timescale that we had a family who had been in that triage, and that took a 6-month period. They are going to refer them on to CAMS, and they've been told 18 months the wait will be for them to have that assessment. Great. Can I just ask, and no part of this is about fault or blame or any of that. It is a genuine question, because Val, you've talked about that issue of capacity, and I have no doubt that those issues of capacity that we have on the ground, you have in your department as well. And we absolutely understand that without question. There's nothing on that plan, I don't think, that anybody would, a lot of that sounds great stuff, great work. There are great ambitions on there. But for me, I think what doesn't come across, and what I'd be interested to ask you about, what is the stepping stone into that? Because at the moment, there's a lot of systems that are, not working. I was reading the trends document that comes after the family of schools have met across the city this last term. And, significant concerns are raised there about SENSAP, about the process for EHCPs, statutory timescales completely out of kilter, that communication of schools with SENSAP, that attempted communication, nothing comes back, messages, etc., etc. I'm sure, there'd be lots of examples of experiences of that. So that kind of day-to-day stuff for schools and SENCOs and staff, that's not working well at all at the minute. And this sounds great, But what are the stepping stones into that? I remember there was a 100-day plan, for example, around Sensap some months ago. What is the progress with that? How is that feeding into this plan? I'd just be quite interested to hear something about that, if you could.
No, thank you for that question. Very much you've just outlined, and we've had the entire conversation that was around capacity. We have had a massive difficulty in terms of capacity, both internally within learning inclusion, but also in terms of all of our support systems as well. So admin support that sits around it, and actually recruiting staff, getting staff. Alongside that, we then had the massive rise in demand for education, health and care plans. So since 2016 to now, we've had 118% rise in requests for education, health and care plans. So if you look at that and then you look at a workforce, I'm going to be very, very honest about this. The workforce was decimated during the COVID period. There was huge traumatic events that occurred within that workforce. We had staff, who unfortunately passed away. That had massive impact as well on other staff. Recruitment then was a massive issue. We have addressed those issues. It has been difficult in trying to get recruitment of staff who've got some background knowledge. We have recruited. We've actually recruited quite a few staff from schools. So we do have a time frame that we are working to, where obviously they have to resign from schools. That's a half terms resignation process that's around it. We now are in a position where we have recruited to the people that have left, and also some new funding that has gone in terms of capacity into that team, again in invest to save model. We have got the funding in place, and we have got 15 new staff that by January will be joining us. So we are working on that 100-day plan, exactly as we said. The recruitment was the priority that was around it. What we've then also done is restructure the whole service. The structure of it before was very much based on, we were advised basically to go down a route basically of being able to be more efficient. What we absolutely understand is that the relational approach, the restorative approach, is absolutely core and crucial to the whole of that department working. So it's partnership working in partnership with parents, young people, working in partnership with schools, early years settings. So we restructured it so there will be named officers for each individual area of the city, aligned to all of our schools. We've restructured it in terms of more officers that are at that ground level that can respond to communication. We have got difficulties, and we're very open, we're very transparent about that in terms of compliance with performance indicators at the moment in terms of completion of education, health and care plans. If I tell you that 2016 to 2019, for the past 6 years, we were used as an exemplar across the entire country because our rates of completion were around the 96% level. We have seen that COVID's had an impact on that, capacity of staffing's had an impact on that, and also, as I say, administration processes. We are confident that January, February time, when we get the new staff in place, we get the training in place, we will see that the percentage rate rises again in terms of that completion rate. I think the one mitigating factor that we have in Leeds as well that sits around this is that because we have a funding for inclusion system in Leeds, which other local authorities do not have, we already invest monies into all of our schools, into all of our young people, because it's a needs-led system rather than a process-led system. So that if schools are identifying particular types of need, the funding goes in to support the school, to support that young person that sits alongside it. That's not negating that some people need an education, health and care plan. Of course they do. Of course they have needs that need specific assessment and sometimes specialist support that sits around it. So we are working, as I've said, on that 100-day plan. That is part of the priority when we talk about those quality plans, the quality implementation of it, a whole framework of monitoring that's also been put in place around that. So yes, we are well aware of those difficulties, and thank you, you know, for actually raising it in terms of understanding that's around capacity. We are addressing it because it's one of our priorities across the whole Children and Families Directorate.
Julie?
Yeah, I'd probably just like to add, so there's a very specific plans that Val's just set out in terms of her service area. In addition to that, we have a transformation plan for the whole directorate. And a key part of that is about reducing bureaucracy and really maximising digitalisation. So what we don't want and what we cannot afford to have, especially in the current climate, if in any climate, is to have some of our staff who are spending time on systems, inputting, recording, as an example, when actually we can have a different approach to that. We can have systems that talk to each other. We can have systems that are not clunky. We can have different roles being utilised to best effect, you know, rather than perhaps social workers, send workers, inputting, as an example. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment as part of that transformation around how we use digitalisation. And key to that is actually talking to our workforce. We've talked earlier about open cultures, you know, so a lot of conversation, a lot of circles with our staff to say, what would make a difference to you? What are the things that are barriers to you being as effective as you can in meeting the needs of children and young people? So there's a range of activity, and that's it's both within the directorate, but it's also cross council. I'll give you an example. I was out in a social work office a few months ago and speaking to a young social worker, and we were talking about mileage and the time it took for them to input the mileage onto a system. And she said, I've got an app that I use. It costs me whatever, a few pounds a month. And my ears pricked up. We brought that back. We've shared that corporately. Our colleagues in IDS have now grasped that, and there's now a new process being put in place right across the council for how people record mileage. So that's an example, you know, and it goes back to that willingness and proactive approach to actually talking to our staff in terms of what would make their life easier and ultimately achieve better outcomes for children and families. So I just think that's a really important part of this conversation. I think the other thing that's been mentioned is just that partnership approach. So the Child Health Population Board is a new board. It's the first time really that we've had a strategic board in Leeds which brings the whole of the health economy together with children's social care. I think what's been really reassuring there is that we're all on the same page when it comes to the areas and the priorities that we need to address. So as has been described, children and young people who with neurodiversity, waiting lists, but the support either pre-diagnosis, but the support post-diagnosis has been recognised as a major priority. We had a parent who came to that board, and again, really important to have the voice of children and young people, parents and carers, who described her experience really of struggling to get that support. That work then and that conversation has fed into the West Yorkshire work that's been described this morning. So there's something about operational plans that are really detailed. There's something about those directorate plans in terms of transformation, but also the strategic multi-agency plans, you know, where people are having the right conversation at the right time. But that's not to minimise the fact that there are challenges, there's national challenges, but you know, and local challenges, but people are doing their very best to address those.
Just on the point of mileage, somebody raised with me recently that they live in the east of the city. They work for the NHS as part of the partnership, early intervention. And they were complaining that they can't afford to wait to the end of the month to get their mileage repaid. So there's an issue there. And one of the links back to retention, they're considering leaving post because they're saying, can't afford to wait to the month end because I'm doing so many miles. But also there is an option for them to work at a centre in the east, but their contract bases them in the west. So they're then going to travel across the city, and that travel is deducted from the mileage claimable as well. So that might be something. Is it something we're looking at, not just from a council point of view, but across the partnership in terms of mileage claims and impact on retention?
Yeah, I probably can't speak for the NHS, but I'll leave another colleague to do that. But certainly it is an area that we have addressed in some particular roles within the local authority, within the directorate, where we have made provisions for colleagues to have an upfront payment. Again, it is the beauty of coming together, again, as you know, as we're just describing, both in terms of with our staff to identify issues that would make a difference, but also as a partnership in terms of some of those solutions. So they're the very things that we have done for some staff and we continue to look at, but I'll let my health colleague respond.
Yeah, because I've got a dedicated role. I don't know the individual for each providers, but I know Leeds Community Healthcare has looked at this issue, because obviously with the community staff, that's a real issue, that petrol costs, and they have put in several schemes and have also really voiced to their staff to come and talk to them if they're struggling. So I know, even though I don't know the details of them, I know it is a conversation they're having and they are looking at ways of addressing it.
So just to come on the back of that as well, another example really that we're progressing within the Children and Families Directorate is the use of pool cars and electric cars. So we have managed to secure, I think, 2-3 of those cars now to be based within our area offices. There's a win-win there in terms of supporting our staff, reducing stress for them in terms of cost of living, but also there's the whole climate emergency. So again, that's just another example of the sorts of things that we are doing, which are quite innovative.
Okay, I have 4 more questions on my order paper. So we've got Councillor Richards first.
Thank you, Chair. It is really good to hear all this, partnership working and trying to find ways in which we can all support one another to promote the inclusion agenda. My question is about the present, and it kind of does lead on. So I'm not going to reiterate and go over the same issues that have been raised by Councillor Renshaw and a colleague from the Church of England over there. In a primary school setting, the SEND needs can be quite impactful, I would say, both for the individual concerned and the context, both for staff and other students. It's as simple as that. And in smaller primary schools, of which in a rural area we have, they become even more impactful. And I was pleased to hear that the additional funding is creating additional posts to actually support schools in a shorter rather than longer term, one hopes in that way. Has this information been shared with the existing schools who are presently coping with these needs in their schools? Because I know of 2 of them that are struggling. I know where we are talking about recruitment and retention, where staff are thinking, is this an environment I want to work in? I know that parents who are saying, is this the right environment? Because it's obviously not the right environment for the individual concerned. They're not in an environment, they're not being supported in that environment appropriately for their needs. And it's a really tricky situation for everybody. So my concern is there a planned programme of dealing with what I would say were really serious needs on the ground in the shorter term, and do the people involved in that situation know it? Thank you.
Val?
Yeah, so within what we talked about there, and I know it was a very sort of whistle-stop tour that went through, but very much about the SEN practice framework, that has been worked with SENCOs from schools. So there's a whole SENCO network that's across the whole city, and all of those SENCOs meet together with staff that are from learning inclusion as well, and they have pulled together and produced the network of SEN practice. And that is about very, very pragmatic things, about identification of need and then things that can be done to meet those needs. So that's a very supportive network that sits alongside that is working with those SENCOs. There's also been lots of information that has gone out that has been through Family of Schools. So Ben Olchin, who is our lead for SENSAP, has done a whole tour of Family of Schools and gone out to talk to schools. When we are invited as well by Family of Schools to come and talk to them, we absolutely do that. There is a communication letter that sits that's around that. We also send out lots of communication that comes from SenSAP itself, an FFI courier that goes out to schools, as well as the information that might be in Leeds Learning Network. So there is lots of different vehicles of communication getting out there, but we do accept that there are times when individual schools either haven't received the message, haven't been able to go to meetings, and often they do contact us on an individual basis. And we are more than willing to talk to all of those schools where they're experiencing difficulties. What we have at the moment are numbers of school where they are finding that, particularly within their early years, they've got children that are going through an interreception that, because of COVID, have never experienced any kind of early years setting or kind of nursery environment or formalised education environment, because they've just not had that opportunity. And therefore, going into a setting, reception age, they find it really difficult. So again, lots of strategies, and the EPs that are linked to all of the schools, working with the schools to develop those strategies and to support the schools in that identification of need, and also place that additional funding that can come through the FFI system. So yes, there's lots of communication that is going on there, but there will always be individual schools that we've not reached or that haven't had the message, and they can contact us and we will send the information through to them, and lots of links that's around that, and also contact details that are around the Senko network that we've established across the whole city.
A very brief supplementary, please.
I do, we'll come back. Yeah, and the resource and the support isn't always just in terms of staffing or anything else like this. Sometimes it's as basic as space, because one of the problems of small schools is they do not have space. So I will advise the two schools that I know of to actually get in touch with you, and maybe then they can look at ways in which that additional support could be offered. Thank you for that.
Okay, if we can keep questions and comments concise now, Councillor Smith.
Thanks, Chair. Mine started off as a circulatory question, really, and then it's kind of evolved. So bear with me. So are we as a city coping with the demands on the increased numbers of SEND pupils, which then leads into, if school resources limited, are the pupils being supported appropriately, which then leads back to what are the numbers of the SEND pupils being homeschooled and the cost to the city for that. Now, leading sort of going back, that was the side of kind of circulatory route, if you like. But then I echo Andrew's comments, because I believe that the issues with SANSEP and the HCP and the timeframes and all of those are actually looping back into that. Your recruitment drive, you're saying you're taking staff from schools, which again is then circulatory again, because you're then leaving schools even shorter of staff. And could any of the 1.6 million underspend, which was reported recently at exec board level, loop into assisting and alleviating any of those issues, because that underspend was mainly in the higher need block. So it's all very circulatory, but I'd like those answers. Thank you.
Councillor Pryor first.
Yeah, I just want to address the that last point first around the underspend. That it's just a figure at month 6 of 12, obviously. So by the end of the year, that almost certainly won't exist. I understand that's going to schools forum meeting in January. I think mid-January that's going to. But it's also important to look at that figure within context. So that figure, we're talking about 0.2% of the DSG budget. So while, yes, that is an underspend, 99.8% of the money has been spent, 92% of which goes directly to settings. But within the wider context, you're right, there are problems. We've discussed at council many times the amount of money that's been cut from the high needs block by the government, and not just cut from Leeds. We know that because of the cap on gains, a child with special educational needs or disabilities in Leeds receives less per child than children with special educational needs and disabilities elsewhere in the country. And that's £22.75 million short that Leeds has been underfunded by, which is a huge amount of money. And you know, you're right, these do have those effects that go round and round. When Val was talking about the staff, some of whom have come from schools to tackle the ECHP backlog, I think is it 14 full-time equivalents? 15, sorry. So we're not talking, while it's a large number of staff to tackle that specific problem around ECHPs, you know, we're not taking hundreds and hundreds of staff out of schools. So I'm not too concerned about that. But on the ECHPs, I think there are issues and we're tackling them, but I think it's also worth looking at. Val mentioned earlier what the significant increase in applications and more than doubling of people coming forward wanting plans. When we look at how many we've got, I think it is around just over 2,000 ECHPs across the, sorry, 5,000. Sorry, it's Val knows the number exactly, far better brief than me. But I think the backlog is around 15% of that. So while it's been doubled, the number that we're dealing with, the backlog is only about 15%. So significant progress has been made, and hopefully with these additional staff, we'll be able to get on top of that, hoping by the end of February.
Okay, Helen, next question.
At the end of last year at our Leeds NEU reps training, we had a fantastic speaker called Janine Booth. She was diagnosed as having autism following her son being diagnosed. And she talked a lot about workplaces becoming more friendly towards people who are neurodivergent, and some companies are not using white backgrounds anymore, are looking at the font they use. They're looking at the types of lighting, environmental noises. And I just wondered whether because there are lots of reasonable adjustments that need to happen for workers and for children in education and early years settings. But I think it might cost money in the short term, but in the long term, if we could make these places, these buildings more compatible for those people, that would be to no detriment to people who are not neurodivergent, and it does seem like the way forward. I just wondered if there are any plans at all or any talks about that, any thoughts?
Okay, Val, please.
Yeah, we do have a whole programme that goes into all of our mainstream schools that are dyslexia-friendly schools, autism-friendly schools, and also when I was talking about the SEND practice framework, a lot of the information that's in there, a lot of the work that is in there is very specific about creating the right environment to meet particular needs. We've also, clearly our young people with sensory needs as well need a very specialised environment where reduced noise, sound. So all of that information is also part of the whole picture that's around the SEND practice framework. So basically looking at all the different kinds of need and the kind of environment and then the kind of provision and the kind of support that needs to be put into place to enable those young people to access school.
Thank you for that. Can I just... Oh, I was just going to come back on something and it's gone out my head. Sorry.
We'll come to Councillor Martin and then we can come back, Helen.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, thank you to officers for bringing this highly informative report and presentation to us. Councillor Pryor has addressed my first question, which was about the extent of the underfunding experienced by Leeds pupils compared to elsewhere. But I just wonder whether we've talked about this increase, really dramatic increase in the number of HCPs in Leeds. Do we know what that's caused by?
Val?
There is an increase across the whole country, not quite as dramatic as we've seen in Leeds, but there is an increase across the whole country. Lots of theories that are around that. Of course, there was the Children and Families Act 2014. Then we had 2 years where we were implementing that act, where we were changing statements into education, health and care plans. and the law change that was around it and the description of education, health needs and where a young person may need a plan. So it was very much a grey area of law in terms of that descriptor of when a plan might be appropriate for a young person. We also, if you think about the whole period from then through to now, we've got a system within the Children and Families Act that really focused on plans rather than the preventative part of the picture. And I think now we've got hopefully emerging much more work that's about that, work that is about the preventative level as well. Within Leeds as well, we have a lower number of education, health and care plans, about 1% lower than we have got across the whole country because of our funding system that goes into place anyway. But yes, some of that legislation also sat around the extension from 2014 within the Children and Families Act up to the age of 25, because education, health and care plans only went up to the age of 19. They then went up to the age of 25. And then to access some of the post-16 provision, post-19 provision, an education, health and care plan was necessary. I do think it was a lack of confidence that was in the system, because the 2014 Children and Families Act that came into place was meant to give that confidence back to parents. I'm not sure that that was successful, hence the review that has taken place now, which is around the whole of the SEM picture that we've been waiting for now for, 2 years. But I do think that was a lack of confidence, and therefore parents feeling that the only way that they can get the support that they need is by having a legal document. And I think there was an awful lot of media attention that was around that and a lot of groups that were pushing that. And now it is the conversation I'm having with the DfE is trying to turn that around, trying to turn it into that preventative work, putting resources in first through funding systems very similar to the one that we've got in Leeds. We did think that the SEN Green Paper, that we would have the implementation plan that would come up before Christmas. That was what they had told us would happen. We discovered yesterday again that there's going to be a delay in that implementation plan. So we're not sure when the actual final outcome from the SEN Green Paper will be published.
Okay, a final question from Councillor Bowden.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you have an answer to this. How much, when a child does get I'm terrible with it, EHCP plan, how much additional funding will the school get?
So our funding system in Leeds doesn't give them additional funding. So we have a system that is needs led. So it's very much about that identification of need. Now, if through the assessment, through an education, health and care plan, you identify additionality or additional needs, or indeed that they may need specialist provision, then that of course would give additional funding. But it doesn't in itself, having an education, health and care plan, give additional funding.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We're heading to time. So the recommendation in the report for this item is that we support communication implementation of the new strategy, considering the views shared by the CYP with SEND during its co-production. Are we happy to accept that recommendation? Okay, thank you. Thank you for all contributors to that item. Thank you for joining us. Item 9 is our work schedule. I'm going to hand over to Angela, who's been in touch with Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Chair. So this report relates to the latest work schedule that's set out in Appendix 1 for members' consideration. Within the covering report, it highlights about a proposed rescheduling of the board's February meeting. This was planned for the 15th of February, but this does actually fall within the school half-term holiday period. And ordinarily, we would love to try and avoid clashes with school holidays. So to rectify this oversight, Councillor Lamb has proposed that the meeting be rescheduled to Wednesday, the 8th of March at 10 o'clock. So this proposal is reflected in the latest work schedule in Appendix 1 for formal agreement by the board. In addition as well, the chair is also proposing that the board holds an additional formal public meeting that will be dedicated to the issue of safeguarding, which is to take place as soon as possible, and when all members of the Leeds Safeguarding Children Partnership Executive are also available to attend. The primary focus will be around the review of the notification process in line with the commitment that the partnership gave to come back to scrutiny to discuss the findings and agreed actions stemming from this review. But the dedicated meeting will also allow for the partnership executive to share information around its broader work around quality assurance and collective learning. So once the date's been identified, then I will send a meeting invitation through. Reflecting on what was mentioned earlier around future in mind strategy, I mean, members of this board will recall that previously this board has had an influence in terms of the refresh of the strategy and had kept sort of a watching brief. I appreciate it's not in this year's work schedule because of other competing work demands, but I'll certainly go back to Councillor Lamb and look at trying to reflect that back in. And then a final reminder that we do have a working group meeting on the 13th of December at 4 o'clock, and that's part of the budget consultation process, which members should already have the invitation for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. That wraps up the formal parts of the item. So thank you very much for your cooperation. Pending the confirmation of the additional meeting, we are next due to meet on the 25th of January. I think you, as well as I, will be hoping that Councillor Lamb is back for that in January. And I think following Sunday, we're technically in Advent, so it falls to me to say have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we shall see you all in January.